Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to start with a quick video before I get into my talk so that you can see a little sampling of the work that we're doing.
Ravi means shining like sun. My passion was acting, directing plays and dancing. I'm very happy and with God's grace, people love me for that. This culture teaches us how to be tolerant, how to understand. I was 8 years plus when the partition took place. Nobody imagined that such a Holocaust will take place. You have played with them, you have lived with them, you have eaten together. And the same people coming and burning your houses and killing you and looting everything. We had to catch the mail train to take us to India. Then while we're going, what we see is heartbreaking. You can see young girls jumping into the well to save the honor because people were just catch the young girls and rape them, and the houses are on fire, people are running, killing each other. Even on the railway track, you see dead bodies, hands cut, legs cut. And when the train came, there was a firing. Who fired, I don't remember, but there was a lot of bullets flying around. And one of the bullets hit me on my left. It's still, there's a mark. But luckily, it scraped through. It didn't damage my bone. There's no first aid kit or bandage or to sterilize it. So my grandmother was in tears. She didn't know what to do. She tore off only dhoti she was wearing and how to sterilize it. In her own urine, she soaked it and cleaned it and put a bandage. But again, when bad luck comes, some good luck also follows. And the good luck was that there was a Muslim family who were to travel at the border town of India. And he had a reservation and he was in railways. He had a lot of influence. Maybe he was good at heart, maybe the money did the trick. Whatever it is, he accepted. We got a place in his compartment, the whole lot of us. The whole train was fully packed and every station there was killing. Even people would come to our compartment also. Okay, is there anybody? That the Muslim gentleman, he had his all credentials with him. He said, it's my family traveling, and so I have to go up to Kasur. So please let me go. There's nobody else, because we would hide ourselves under the seat, in the bathroom, and then only his Muslim family would be visible. And then when we saw the other compartments, there was nobody survived the whole train. So partition was a curse on the human history. Such kind of hatred should never come in anybody's life. I hope my future generation or your generation or your future generation don't see the kind of history that we have gone through.
Okay, so that was the story of Major General Ravi Chopra. And it's actually, the full interview is about 3 hours long. That's just a tiny clip that we had made for a campaign with New York Times a few years ago. I'm going to talk to you about how we revived in the public domain the memory of partition through our work. And our work revolves around preserving the people's history of partition. So about 10 years ago, when we first started this work, at least I felt, and a lot of other people may feel the same way, the public memory of partition was pretty much gone, pretty much disappearing from our public domain. Most kids my age at the time, most young people were not aware of partition, and if they were aware of it, they knew it was something from their grandparents. It wasn't really taught in schools. It was not in most people's textbooks in this country, not across the border in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and also mostly just completely non-existent from most countries' curriculums. And so we wanted to change that. And why do we want to learn about partition? I personally felt then, and I still do to this day, that partition formed such a defining moment in our modern South Asian history. It affected politics, it affected culture very drastically, it affected economics, in ways that we don't even understand because we have not self-reflected at all. And so that's what we wanted to try to understand, not just for ourselves, but also for our collective community. And so let me just go a little bit into the history. So post-World War II, what was happening? The British Empire was collapsing. They were pretty much bankrupt, and they needed to pull out of their colonies, India being the biggest one, as fast as they could, because the colonies had become a burden. And in India in particular, there was a huge freedom movement that they no longer had the resources to suppress. And so as they pull out, they wanted to do it really, really quickly. And if that's annoying people, I don't know how to move that, sorry. And so as they were pulling out, they did this very, very quickly, and you know the whole story, the Radcliffe Line was drawn and so on. So I'm not going to go into the known history of that, but basically that's what the Radcliffe Line looks like. It was based loosely on census data, but we know that the real life line went through people's houses, it went through farms, and the idea was that you had Muslim majority areas and you had Hindu majority areas, and that's what India and Pakistan, the new countries, were going to be based along those lines. And I say new countries because we think that India has been around for a long time, but we have to remember that British India coexisted with 560-something kingdoms. Sure, they were protectorates, but they were politically still separate entities. And India is a European word. It's of Greek origin. It's an English word. So it's not like it's been, you know, like a subcontinent thing forever. So that's really interesting because the people's history that we've been recording really brings that out. People's identities in the kingdoms were really different than people's identities in British India. So imagine for a second if the Holocaust in Europe had not been documented, and if Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if we didn't have any witness accounts. We have a very, very different understanding today of the Holocaust, and maybe we wouldn't even remember. Maybe there would have been many more dictatorships after that. But what's come out of the Holocaust is the UNHCR, for example, and knowledge about dictatorships that we've been able to apply as a global community around the world. Not always, but in most cases. And in terms of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear non-proliferation movement came out of that. And that's been a really important movement. I mean, the globe is still here, the world is still here, we're still alive. We haven't had a third world war yet. And, you know, we can thank some of that to what we've learned from the oral histories in Hiroshima. Yet, we had this massive event around the same time, around World War II, around, you know, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Holocaust, and it was here, right here in South Asia, and this is the partition. So 1% of the world's population, 1 in 100 people approximately, lost their homes at the time of partition. That's a massive number. Today that would be about 70 million people or more, if you think about it in those terms. 14% of the world's population was impacted. So that's all of South Asia, because we only think, and I'm going to talk about this later, we think, okay, it was Punjab and Bengal that were affected, but that's not true, because people moved all over the subcontinent. You have people moving, you know, in large numbers to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, for example, that we never thought would be affected by partition. You have people moving to the most remote corners of South Asia due to partition, in and out. So 14%, 1 in 8 people in the world were in some way affected by partition. And then what happens next? A lot of the people who were affected by partition, they end up being some of the, you know, initial major diaspora of the last century that moved out of India into a lot of the Western cultures, Western countries, including my family, because they were still looking for more opportunity. They didn't necessarily settle very well where they moved after partition. So just to give you my background and how I'm connected to this history, well, I do come from a partition-affected family. From my father's side, they moved from Lahore to Delhi. And how I became aware of that history, I come from an army background, or my father does. So we lived in all of these military places. Born in Delhi, lived in Leh Ladakh, Jammu Kashmir, obviously very aware of the conflict there growing up, and Pune. But I also spent all my summers in Punjab, in a village where my grandparents were, very close to the border with Pakistan. And we used to go to the Baga border, which at the time was a loosey-goosey fence. It was not this elaborate thing that it is now. And it was like a little forest that was separating India and Pakistan. And we used to go and wave at the guards, and we used to ask them for, I think it was 7-Up that they had that we didn't have. So that was sort of and I knew, that was my early memory of partition, and I knew that my family had come from the other side. So fast forward to 2008 in Japan, I was finishing a part of my PhD in Tokyo, and I took a trip down to Hiroshima, and that's when I came across the incredible peace memorial that they have in Hiroshima, and the oral history accounts that they have of the survivors. So in high school in the US, in 9th grade, we had this like 2 or 3 month long period where we just learned about Hiroshima. We watched tons of movies, we read tons of books, but really nothing hit me like the oral histories, because it was, watching people's facial expressions, it was seeing them talk about it, their tone, their body language, it conveyed what their experiences and what they went through at a visceral level. Like I learned about how people who were, affected by the bomb, the ones that survived, no one would hire them or marry them because they were considered contaminated. So even if they survived the bombing, their life was still ruined in a way. So those types of things that you can only learn from oral history and oral accounts. And it was in that moment that this problem that I've been thinking about my whole life, that, hey, why is it that, people in the village talk about partition, but it's not even recognized officially in our history books? So I used to think about that a lot growing up. And I realized in that moment it's because we didn't have the witness voices. So the event almost had lost legitimacy in the second and third generation. And what those original voices do is they keep the event alive for generations, because you can really learn from it. They're preserved over time. And so that was the aha moment for wanting to gather oral histories of partition. Fast forward to 2013, I left my job at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in California. I was a physicist by then doing research, and I didn't leave because I was like, oh yeah, let's go do this thing where we're going to record stories and create an organization. It was more just like I started recording stories on my own, and I was like, wow, there's no way I can do this. Way too many people were signing up to record their stories, and I was just one random person with a camcorder. And so I started asking other people. I started going to student clubs and mosques and whatever I could find in the Bay Area where there were South Asian gatherings, and saying, hey, does anyone else want to do this? We should all do this together. I did not plan to leave my career, but at one point this project started to get so big, and the demand on my time got so huge that I had to make a decision. Am I going to be a physicist, or am I going to do this? And I realized that the laws of physics was going to be around, for eternity. I could keep keep doing that forever. But the people who remembered partition were not going to be around forever, so it needed to be done now. And people in that age group were in their 80s and 90s and above, and they were dispersed across the world, so there was an urgency, and we needed to do this now. And since people were all over the place, how were we going to get to them? And how were we going to get to them very quickly? This is when we came up with the idea of crowdsourcing, and that's how the 1947 Partition Archive was born. The idea was to create something that was totally people-powered, both financially and the actual work, so that it was the people building their history. And you also get a lot of grassroots education in that way. So just to give you the actual inspiration behind the crowdsourcing idea, I know it's a little bit hippy-dippy, but this painting, Building a Rainbow, I saw this in a thrift shop in New York when I was 15 years old, and I was very inspired by it. It's basically lots and lots of little stick figures, lots of little stick people, and they're all coming together to build something that's far greater than themselves for society. And I always thought that that was a really cool concept for a lot of people to come together to build something for the greater good. And then, fast forward a couple of decades, physicists at Berkeley actually coined the term crowdsourcing because they used the knowledge of the crowd to solve the protein folding problem, which our computers could not, but the human brain can still compute in non-linear ways. And that happened to be a department that I came from, so I was familiar with that concept. So our mission is to document, preserve, and share eyewitness accounts from all ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic communities affected by partition. Why do I say it like that? Why do we put emphasis on all ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic communities? When we first started this work, not having totally grown up in South Asia, I grew up here partly and then moved to the US. I was really shocked when we would go to people's houses and they'd be like, well, you're a Punjabi Sikh, and why do you want to record Bengali stories, and why do you want to record XYZ stories? And I was like, wow, I never thought about that. Like, why can we not record stories from anyone? Partition affected everybody. So I wasn't trained to think along those ethnic, religion, and socioeconomic lines that culturally people get trained in South Asia, as I'm learning now. So we wanted to create a platform that was available to everyone equally. And there was some resistance in the beginning, but we managed to overcome that, and everybody now understands that it is open to anyone and everyone, and that part is respected. And the problem is that partitions have continued on since 1947, so the global community has not learned from this either. So there's Bosnia, there's Rwanda, there's Korea. Israel-Palestine happened in 1948. It was inspired by the India-Pakistan Partition. They took a lot of examples from that. And Iraq, they were thinking about partitioning Iraq along communal lines, and I was just sitting there thinking like, wow, they haven't learned from the India-Pakistan Partition. Another problem in South Asia is the lack of historical preservation. We're heirs to an ancient civilization. We may think we've done enough, but if you go to other parts of the world, you'll see that we actually have not done enough to preserve and learn from ancient history. And there's many cultural reasons for that, so I don't need to go into that. But that's something I was really aware of, and because on my uncle's farm in Punjab, and maybe if there's other people who are familiar with farms in Punjab can attest to this, they would, because of the water table going down since the 80s, since the Green Revolution, they have to dig deeper and deeper wells, and so they find a lot of treasure, and they find ancient treasures. The gold is usually melted, and the non-gold stuff, is thrown out. So me being the kid, I used to get the non-gold stuff, and I forever wanted to know what these coins were. And some of these coins ended up being like 2,000 years old from when the Greeks were ruling Punjab. Very fascinating stuff. But what was really disappointing to me, even as a kid, was that there was no official effort or no incentive for people like farmers to turn over some of these incredible things they were finding over to the government or to other people, to other authorities. And like they do in Europe, they have such types of programs in Europe so that things are turned over and history is preserved. So our solution to the problem, going into this lack of historical preservation, was to crowdsource. So crowdsourcing is frugal. From our perspective, we didn't have like the huge amount of funding that, say, the Holocaust projects had in the 1950s. It's fast. We could use technology instantaneously to reach people across the world with this idea through social media. Social media played a huge role for us. And it's very engaging. So suddenly you create a lot of interest in history amongst people who were not perhaps interested, who didn't think it was interesting before. And so just to show you some photos, this is in 2010, a couple of us, we spent several weeks, we just lived in this little tiny place in the bazaar in Amritsar, the walled city, and we went from shop to shop, and we were just fascinated by some of the stories. Some of these shops were like 300 years old, and some of the family histories along with the partition histories, like some of these heirloom stories passed down in the families about the history of even Amritsar over a few hundred years was very, very fascinating, and that's all recorded in the archive now. So when we first started, we were just, like I said, going, it did start in the US because that's where I was based at the time. We were going to every possible event. We also had a lot of collaborations with the university that I was at the time, UC Berkeley. So we taught classes, and a lot of volunteers from a lot of different ethnicities came on board. Interestingly, in the very early days, this idea did not catch on amongst South Asian students who were more geared towards more mathematical fields. I was too, I was a physicist. It was like mostly non-South Asian students who really took interest in trying to document this history that was not very well known. It was only when this became more and more popular that a lot of South Asian students started coming on board as well. And then eventually it caught on in India as well. So how it works, So citizens go around the world, or in their communities rather. They take their camera, they record stories. They can even use a phone these days. And we do a training. We teach people for free how to record these stories and all the specifics of oral history. We've created a lot of material that people can take with them to the field. We have these massive questionnaires, different questionnaires for people in different fields. Like if you were interviewing somebody who was, in agriculture, they'd get a different set of questions, and if you were interviewing a musician or somebody who was like a weaver, and so on. So the questions were developed according to different types of circumstances and so on, and geographies as well. So once people record these huge videos, they upload them to our site, and that was a huge technological problem we had to solve. It's still a problem, how to upload massive videos. Like YouTube, yeah, they figured it out, but they're not going to tell us how they did it. So luckily, being in Silicon Valley, we got some brilliant young startup folks who figured out a proprietary solution, which is actually part of their startup now, but they used our application to figure out that solution. So we used their solution on our back end to get these huge videos from around the world uploaded. So, when people are uploading from the Sundarbans or something on a phone connection, even if their connection drops, they can still carry on the next day and so on. And so once these stories are uploaded to the archive, we share them through social media. And even more people get inspired then to go record stories and share them. And in the process, there's a lot of old friends and family that have been separated for 70 years due to partition have found each other on social media. And that's been really beautiful. There's like almost 1 million followers now on social media of these stories. So just to demonstrate visually, stories come in from around the world, they go into the cloud. The cloud right now is managed from Berkeley, but we have an office in Gurgaon that's actually even bigger than the Berkeley office at this moment. Our goal is to record 10,000 accounts at least that are very diverse. So we're at over 6,000, so over 6,000 families have come forward and shared their oral histories with us. This is no small feat because the process of recording one story on average is between 10 to 14 hours is what we've found, because there's training that's involved, there's travel that's involved, there's a lot of different components, and once they're done recording the stories, they have to generate the metadata, they have to write the summaries, and then those summaries have to get reviewed, and so on. Over 600 people have volunteered to record these stories, so that's an amazing contribution. They've come from 12 countries so far, and some of these countries we never expected, like Mexico. I did not know there were partition witnesses in Mexico. Poland, Israel. Stories from Israel have been fascinating because you had Bene Israel Jews living in Karachi who migrated to Pune during partition, and then a lot of the young boys were recruited during Israel's builders movement when they were trying to build Israel. And so they all migrated without their parents and never saw their parents again, and grew up in kibbutz and so on. So very, very fascinating hidden subaltern sort of histories there. And they've come in from over 400 villages and cities around the world in 24 languages and almost 1 million followers on social media at this moment. And altogether, people have donated over 80,000 hours so far in volunteer service to make this archive possible. So if you go to the map on our website, just to show you a glimpse, so you'll see a mapping of where all the stories are from. And if you click on a city, you can see where people migrated from that city, and then you can click on their individual stories, and you can watch, if we have the videos up, you can watch the videos, but you can see photos and you can read summaries. We give credit to everyone, even the donor that supported the story gets on there, the archivist, everybody who volunteered or contributed in some way to make this story possible is on there. One of the cool things we're doing right now is we're working with Stanford University libraries to bring all of these stories to the world, and especially the library system around the world. So these stories are not only getting cataloged in a library so that they're accessible to researchers, but they're going to be streamed around the world. And for the very sensitive stories that are not going to be publicly streamed because it might endanger someone's life, we're working with Tata Trust actually to stream that exclusively to a number of universities in India where anyone can go and see these stories under a controlled and safe environment so that they're not misused. And I've listed some of the universities here that we're working with. So the archive is already in active use. There's been a couple of films, even from Bollywood, that have used the archive. So I know in Bhag Milkha Bhag, they did some research when they made that movie, and they used the public information we had. They didn't actually go in deep into the archive, but that was pretty neat to know that some of the stories from the archive influenced some of the scenes in that movie. The archive, there's already stories in a couple of museums. There's the Anandpur Sahib, there's a museum there, the Virasat-e Khalsa Museum, and they have an exhibit on the oral histories. There's the Museum of Human Rights in Canada that has an exhibit on the oral histories. There's a number of media organizations, authors, artists that have used the oral histories as well. So even though they're not public yet, they're going to be public next year, they're already in use, which is really, really promising. We also want to do K through 12 education, so I personally believe that just like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, just like the Holocaust, they're in curriculum around the world. See, everybody here knows about Hiroshima, Nagasaki. It happened in Japan. Everyone here knows about the Holocaust. It happened, obviously centered around Germany, but it happened across Europe. But in these places, people have never heard of partition. Most people have not heard of partition. We want to change that. We want the whole world to have this as part of their K through 12 curriculum. Quickly, just a glimpse at some of the learnings. So I was just in the Sundarbans in March because we have a team recording stories there. At first I was like, why are we going to have stories in a tiger forest? But it turns out that a lot of the stuff going on there with tiger widows is very much connected to partition. So what happened is there was a lot of people who came from economically diminished communities that were not given land in Calcutta or, some viable farmland in other parts of Bengal. They were settled in large numbers in the Sundarbans, and the part of the Sundarbans that a lot of native tribal people would not live in because it's prone to flooding. And so what's happening with climate change is a lot of these islands that these people had settled on are just drowning, so they're becoming climate refugees. And when they moved to the Sundarbans, they didn't have the same skills as a lot of the native people in coping with the tigers and the kind of environment that they had there. So you do have many more tiger widows. You do have a lot more tiger attacks on people because they didn't know how to cope with the environment. And as you know, there's a huge thing going on there with the tiger widows and a lot of support that they get from the government and so on. So we're still uncovering a lot of the connection between partition and some of the modern issues in the Sundarbans, social issues. Oh, that's just me with some of the people in the Sundarbans who are helping us do this work there. So some really other interesting, fascinating histories. This gentleman that we interviewed, he was 104 at the time. He's passed on since. He passed on at the age of 107. And he was a weaver, and he remained a weaver for like 80 years of his life or something. It was really fascinating. But he told us this really interesting fact. I don't know if it's a fact, but he told us a really interesting story about chai, which I thought was a staple South Asian drink. He told me that in the early 1900s, him and his friends and a lot of young people were boycotting chai because it was being sold by the East India Company, and they were boycotting the British by boycotting chai because they felt the British were going around and spiking people's milk in the villages to get them addicted to chai, to try to turn it into this popular drink so that they could sell more chai. I thought that was really interesting. So we've also recorded stories about musical gharanas that were broken up because of partition. Stories have also come in from really unique places, like we've had stories come in a language called Torvali, which only has 3,000 speakers. It's in the Hindu Kush Mountains in, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. And really fascinating stories about how people there were affected by partition, which I would never have thought that partition affected people all the way in Hazara district and so on in the northwest area. But the lines there, even though it was not between India and Pakistan, there was a line there that was being drawn. So this is a story of Mr. Elias, who's from the Jewish community, I think either from Lahore or Karachi, that migrated at the time of partition. And this is a lady named Erin Riggs, who's recording a story in New York. Erin was super inspired by these stories that she recorded as an undergraduate student, and she went on is now using the archive to do her PhD in Binghamton. And she just spent a year in Delhi researching evacuee properties, and she's learning a ton about what happened, how these properties were basically given to people and so on, and the rules that were used, and how architecture changed in Delhi because of it. So really fascinating research also coming out of the archive, and people who contributed in building the archive. This is just sort of the early days of research. And of course, we all know the princely states and a lot of the Maharajas, a lot of those subdued histories which we don't learn in school are starting to really shine in the archives, because as you meet people from the kingdoms, they remember things that are not taught in textbooks. They tell us facts about the kingdoms that are not taught in textbooks. And that is an indigenous history that's sort of, been under the carpet in a way for our generation. We're also learning a lot of really fascinating insights into the origin of the violence at the time of partition. So I grew up hearing, oh, neighbors just started killing neighbors. And I was like, well, that's crazy. Like, why would that happen? How would neighbors just go wild and animalistic and start killing each other? But it turns out, what we're finding from the stories is the neighbors didn't really kill neighbors in most instances, unless they had some beef between them already. So usually neighbors saved each other, regardless of religion. What often happened is that people came from communities that were far away. They weren't personally connected. So they might come in from a village 2 or 3 villages away as a mob. And we've talked to a lot of people who were part of the mob, people who were, teenagers, and they actually committed the violence. And they said that the only thing that was driving them, it wasn't really religion. The thing that was driving them was economic, that they were going to go and they were going to loot. They were going to loot these people, and they were going to become wealthier than they were. So it was very economically driven is what we're finding. Religion became sort of a political excuse. And that's just it's not like something that needs to be studied further. Let me just put it that way. So it seems there was a lot of top-down polarization. A lot of these mob attacks were incited by small local politicians, often because what would happen is you would get a big group of refugees coming in, and the local politician would be like, oh, whoa, I don't have enough housing in my area. We need to get rid of some people to house some of these people who are coming in. And they would incite violence to create a little bit of a migration. So we're seeing a lot of this from the stories. Of course, this is not general, but these are just some of the things that we're seeing coming out of the stories about the violence. So when there was a transfer of power from between the British government and the new Indian and Pakistani government, it seems that there was a period of time where there was a complete breakdown in governance and civil society sort of broke down. So if you think about what would happen today in Mumbai if the police and military kind of went away for a couple of weeks, what would happen? So you can just use your imagination. That's kind of what happened at the time of partition, when a lot of military was called back in that was not ethnically related to Punjabis, for example, or Bengalis. When you had non-Punjabi and non-Bengali regiments coming in, a lot of the violence went down drastically. So some of the interventions that are happening because of this work, stories are now starting to remain within the families. They're starting to spread in the communities. The awareness of partition that we've seen grow in the last 10 years since this work kind of began, it's been immense, because you can actually do numerical analysis, which we're doing right now. You can look at Google keywords. You can see how the searches around partition have grown along with the number of stories being shared. So last year alone, our stories were shared 10 million times, more than 10 million times on Facebook. And you can see some of the effects of that. You could see a lot of new projects coming about. We're recording stories or just doing other things around partition. There's a lot more authors working on partition. So in a way, some of this inspiration from the stories, or from this act of gathering stories, even if it's not directly affecting people, it's making partition an okay topic to talk about. And it's getting a lot of people to dig deeper, which is kind of one of the things that we wanted to happen when we started this work. And there's a lot of cross-border communication. And on our Facebook page, which has almost 1 million followers, it's been very positive. We do not really do any policing on our page, because people sort of self-police. Most of the time, it's very, very positive, heartwarming sort of communication. And every now and then, if something funny gets posted, it just automatically gets policed by other people who are following our page. So for us, we just kind of look at it, and it's always very positive. And so that's been really neat to see. If you create the right space and the right platform, people will behave in a nice way. So I already talked about the number of shares that we had last year. Some of the results of this, like I said, it's normalizing the people's memories of partition in the mainstream. It's inspired a lot of other works. I talked about a lot of the media and arts uses already, so I won't go into that. So basically this resource is being built for you. You can also use it, but you can also help build it because we're building it right now, and in a way you'll be putting your mark on history if you build it. So if we have time, I'll end with another video.
One morning we were sleeping and there was a loud voices. So there I saw thousands of people surrounding the village with arms. Then my uncle came running. So he took us to the center of the village. He said go into that room and stay there, and all the village women and children were in that room. After about maybe 2-3 hours, which was like an eternity for us, somebody banged on the door and the guy shouted that open the door, otherwise we will fire inside and set the room in fire. So they told us to sit under a big tree and they start killing. My cousin got shot, and then my brother, he saw what was going on, so he started running. So one guy came with a spear and hit him. So my mother saw that and she ran after him. So she fell over him and they both were killed there. I was very traumatized. I was standing there not knowing what's happening. The gunman was only about 10 feet away, sort of, he shot at me a few times, every time he missed. So I started running then. One guy came with a spear. He tried to kill me. In the meantime, I bumped into the other guy. He was killing too. The other guy came to kill. He said, no, don't kill him. And the guy said, why not? And the one who was holding me, he said, no, I want to take this child with me. We were traveling and I was always wondering what's going to happen to me. And where he's taking me, he didn't explain to me anything. We walked 2 nights, day and night, to get to some village which I don't know the name now. So there he left me with the family. And then 6 months I lived with them. Because there was agreement with India and Pakistan that whoever is left in both countries, they should be recovered and brought back to the respective countries. They came and at about 9:30, 10 o'clock. My uncle's cousin who was there told me about my father's name and my uncle's names and all that. So then I was kind of satisfied that he knows the family, so he'll be okay to go with. So I got into the refugee camp, and my uncle, he came because he was 30 miles away in a town called Kasur. So he came from there every day to look for us. My uncle didn't realize what I needed. That all I needed was hugged and loved and be assured that I'm safe now. Then, when I was 12-year-old, then my life changed. I met my friend. With him, I found that I belonged to somebody. And I was not alone anymore. What my friend taught me, I forgave to the even people who killed my family. My own way of thinking is that just love everyone, hate no one. That's where I look at it.
With his story, I wanted to mention, I'm not sure how clear it was, but he was orphaned at the time of partition. And then there was this huge episode that we left out of that clip because his oral history is 3 hours or more long, and that clip was 3 minutes. But basically, he was kidnapped by one of the gunmen. For some reason, everybody was killed except him. And they took him and they walked for several days. and he was adopted. So, you know, he was Muslim, but he was adopted into a Sikh family and then given a new name and then converted and everything. And then he lived like that for 6 months with their kids, and they worked on the farm together. I don't know why, maybe they needed a helping hand on the farm, who knows. But eventually somebody who was enemies with that family decided to report them, and the Pakistani army sent somebody to pick him up because there's some recovery thing going on at that time where they were recovering women and children and getting them on the other side of the border, kidnapped women and children. And so we've met a lot of people who claim to have been kidnapped who were as kids and, you know, grew up on farms. Maybe they were from a wealthy family and then they were raised as like a farm laborer, or maybe, you know, all kinds of situations like that we've come across. So eventually some extended family relatives found him, and they also raised him as like a stepchild that was made to clean and do these types of things. So when he graduated high school, he sort of ran away. He hitchhiked all the way through the Middle East and made his way to London, and then kind of built his own life and is now living a very, very good life in Fremont and has lots of grandkids and so on. So, I mean, there's a lot of people in that situation at that time who maybe didn't have his fate and did not end up where he did today.
I was living mostly with my uncle, that's his mother's brother, who had no issue of his own. And he was living in Ahmedabad. That's where I met Gandhiji. I was 4 years or 5 years. 4 or 5 years. I used to call him Bapu. It was nice because I could always have a hold on everybody. Don't say anything, Bapu is my dad. I can go and tell him Bapu. At that time they were thinking of partitioning Sindh. So when I saw nobody around, I went and said, Bapu, Sindh ne ke pachad padya cho? That means, why are you after Sindh? Early morning we used to get up, say about 6 o'clock, collect all the children every day. Britishers ko bhagao, quit India, quit India. We used to take that procession from all these near about places, and then return by 8:30 also, and then get ready and go to school. I was once jailed also, taken to jail. Then they put me, we were about 10 girls, boys and girls. We were put in a van. We were taken quite far off. Rani Bagh, they used to call it that place. They took us there. It was evening, 7 o'clock, and they said, get down from the bus. No, start walking to your house. For a child of 10, 12 years, it's very difficult, but had to do it, had to reach. Just before partition, I was married, and Manju was only 2 years old. So I thought, well, I have been going about seeing places, why not this daughter of mine should see some places. I'll take my daughter, I'll show her the world. I took her to Ahmedabad, and from there I took her to Bombay. And there I got letter and a phone call and all that, come back. India is going to be partition, this thing, that thing. Then so I took this girl, came back, and thinking that we are not going for good. I didn't bring anything, would you believe, just 2 suitcases, clothes, as if we are going back. Never thought that we'll not go back.
So I found this really fascinating because in the 1940s, she was trying to travel the world with her daughter for fun. That's pretty interesting. And then also this thing which she talks about partitioning Sindh, which was in the talks, but I've never read that anywhere. But that's something that's come out from this oral history, and we've heard it 1 or 2 other times. that there were these sort of talks going on, but it never happened. So those types of interesting things that you can see from oral history. So that's all we have for you today in terms of content. Questions?
Spend a moment telling us about the differences between the Punjab partition and the Bengal partition, because the Punjab partition seems to overshadow the Bengal one in terms of numbers, violence, etc. So is there any stark differences between the two partitions, apart from Kashmir, which is now a political thing?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that in terms of oral history, we have maybe even more oral histories from Bengal because they're crowdsourced, and somehow the crowd in Bengal is submitting more stories than in Punjab. But interestingly, we see very, very violent stories come out of Bengal, from Bihar, from Uttar Pradesh, but I don't know why. They're not, in the popular memory, Punjab is still like supposed to be the really violent partition, but oral histories tell us something really different. So, I mean, we can have a lot of different theories about this. A lot of Punjabis came to Delhi and their voices were magnified because it being the capital. I know that, so pre-partition data does tell us that Lahore was one of the two centers of education in South Asia. So, you know, Calcutta was the other one, and I think actually there was one in the south as well in Chennai. But Lahore was an extremely educated city, so when all those Punjabis that were super educated and they were in the media, they were in the press, they were talking about it. I mean, that's just my theory, but Bengal, it seems there was a lot of violence that happened there as well during partition. In Punjab, it was concentrated in a smaller amount of time. That could be it too. There was like that 3-week period where it was really, really intense. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe once, you know, the archive is built, we can, tons of researchers, when they go in, they'll find a lot more answers. At the moment, we're in collection phase.
So there is a lot of written literature regarding partition. So is there any sort of gap in the literature that these oral histories or oral accounts seem to fill?
Yeah, like I said, so in terms of people relating to partition on a human level, in the literature you don't hear tone of voice, you don't see people's expressions, you don't see their body language. Those things make an account hit you on a visceral level. It hits you in a different way than literature. Literature offers you a form of analysis that, you know, an oral account like this will not. So different mediums, but they each, I feel, hold their value in a very strong way.
Guneeta, firstly, congratulations on this fantastic mission that you've undertaken. I myself come from a family, my grandparents' generation, and I've grown up on stories of partition, some of them rather unbelievable, to me, at least when I was a child. And it's very heartening to see that you're trying to put this history together, document it. The question that, and this is fantastic work, the question that comes to mind is how does one channelize this to somehow prevent what is the root cause? The fault lines still exist. While there was a certain scale to the violence and the mishap that occurred during the partition, smaller events continue to happen. And if you actually analyze them, you realize that the root cause is very much entrenched into the society, into politics, into administration, because it was a failure at multiple levels. And this could be, and I'm sure you probably thought of it, and I can see some references towards the end of your presentation, but this could be a phenomenal body of work that could then be channelized to actually make a difference. Whether it is individual perceptions, whether it is lessons from an administrative point of view, because it was also an administrative collapse. It was a time bomb that the entire country was sitting on, and nobody saw it coming. And when it happened, nobody really, for a long time, we were just numbed and stunned. And what is concerning is that continues to occur in smaller, Gujarat or in smaller incidents that happen. The root cause, the problem is fundamentally very much there. And can we take this work that you've done or started to do and actually, make sure that we make a difference, we make a preventive difference? And it's not a question, it's just a suggestion.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think that's something that we've been thinking about a lot. And there's a couple of answers to that. One, the first answer, well, since it is an open platform and it is an archive that's going to be openly accessible, other people with brilliant ideas that maybe nobody in our organization has thought of and will think of can come forward and bring those ideas to life. So maybe you have an awesome idea of how to use this to prevent some of this violence. We have an idea too, I have an idea, and that is, I believe these stories do ignite empathy, and I believe the opportunity that we have with Partition is different from the opportunity that we had to learn from the Holocaust, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With Holocaust, it was preventing genocides, right? With Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's preventing a nuclear Holocaust, basically, human tragedy from nuclear warfare. In our case, I think we can move beyond communal violence. Maybe we cannot prevent it, but we can learn about the root causes of communal violence. We can analyze that. And then once we analyze it and understand it, I don't think we're there as a society yet. Once we analyze it and understand it, we can start teaching it to students at a young age. Sort of a memoir. So actually, a lot of witnesses that we've interviewed, after we interview them, they've been inspired to write memoirs. And we have thought about launching a memoir service because a lot of them have approached us themselves and said, hey, would you post my memoir on your website? We haven't done anything like that yet, but we are in talks with people to see if that's something we want to do. Yeah, there's a lot of memoirs that are out there. They may not be on any popular publishing platforms, but on our website, there's a thing called Partition Library, and if you click that, we try to list every book out there that we can find that has a significant amount of information on at least one chapter on partition, and in there you'll find memoirs as well.
Thank you. We have one last question there behind.
So one of the biggest problems I would assume that you face with oral history is reliability and bias. So one, how do you combat that? And the other question, it's a two-part question. The other part I wanted to ask you is, once you collect all the interviews, what is the end goal eventually? Like once we reach 10,000 plus interviews, how do we archive it? Because obviously it's not going to be easy for some person to go through all the interviews. So what is the end goal there?
Yeah, so I'll speak to the end goal first. So in terms of the end goal, well, we're going to keep recording. At 10,000 is our initial goal. We'll keep recording, but we're not an organization that's only recording. If you look at our full mission, our whole mission is to actually, document partition and raise awareness on it. So that can be done by creating incentives to use the archive, making it available to researchers. Oh, I guess getting some feedback loop there. For right now, our next goal is to create some sort of public structure as well that creates a lot of immersive learning. I'm really inspired by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. I'm inspired by the Holocaust Memorial in the US. I know there is a partition museum, but it's not like using oral histories the way we do. So I think with the content that we have, there is an incredible amount of you can do a lot of immersive teaching through exhibits and so on. And obviously ignite research in academia so that new information comes about, and ignite K through 12 learning. So there's a lot of that we want to do in the future. And now since I've answered that, I've forgotten your first question, so if you don't mind repeating
about
that.
Oral history in general, about the problems you face.
Yeah, so in that case, well, the first thing is our stories are focused on personal experiences. So when you focus on someone's personal observations and experiences, there's less of an incentive to embellish because they're not competing against anyone or anything, right? It's not competitive. It's about their feelings, their observations. So that's one thing. Secondly, as a researcher, you have to cross-check. So we're not the researchers. We're the primary source gatherers. So we gather the primary source, we make it available to you, and then you as the researcher have to go in and use your research techniques like cross-checking and whatnot to verify. So we use the best possible techniques out there to gather the information for you. So if you want to think about it in scientific terms, yeah.
You know, one name that sort of came to mind, someone doing similar work, is Urvashi Bhutalia. So have you been in touch with her?
Sorry,
or
who is
could
it?
you-
Rishi Bhattalia, yeah, she's written a book.
collected a lot of oral.
She's done 70 accounts, and she wrote a book on it, and is probably the first. She was the second person. The first person was Andrew Whitehead from BBC, who did it in the 1980s. He did about 400 stories for the BBC, and then Urvashi did about 70, and she wrote a book on it. So yes, absolutely, we've been in touch. We've communicated a lot. She's even been an advisor to our cause. But yes, very different in the way that this is not a written archive, and it's a book format. This is videos that are available to anyone, so anyone who wants to write a book can use these. It's a different format.